Joan by Carol M Mottershead, Chapter 18, Our Return to England. Surprisingly true to his word, Donetian's contact arranged for us to become part of an expedition leaving Alexandria to England. Manpower was needed to transport an ancient artefact known as the Rosetta Stone, and we were to report to a British military officer, Colonel Turner, on arrival. The first part of our journey was arduous, as it meant travelling over lands unknown to us, from France to Egypt. It was reminiscent of our journey to Italy after Pulcinella escaped execution, only stopping one place long enough to eat, sleep, and earn enough money to replenish our stocks to keep us going. The sea journey was far easier by contrast. I was able to enjoy the fresh wind in my face this time, instead of sleeping away the journey like before. With calm waters and a good strong breeze behind, forcing us onwards, we made good time, in the beginning at least. After nearly 5 months at sea, the novelty wore off. The seas became more turbulent the nearer to northern Europe we became, and our once strong sea legs no longer gave the support we once had. Our stomachs paid the price. It was with blessed relief when we finally arrived at Portsmouth, where we were to begin the final leg of our journey. Responsibility for the consignment would be over once it was relinquished into the hands of Thomas Young at the British Museum. Unfortunately, bureaucracy stood in our way. Security was stricter than last time we were on British soil. Soldiers with guns were everywhere, on the lookout for French spies. Luckily, Colonel Turner was able to vouch for us, and we were allowed to complete our assignment, but it did raise considerable concerns over just how much our accents were going to be a problem. Thomas Young, also known amusingly by his colleagues as the last man who knew everything, was indeed young. Younger than we expected for such a knowledgeable man. He had been tasked to decipher the ancient Rosetta Stone with its 3 ancient languages of ancient Greek, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and an even more ancient language known as Demotic language, a language that had not been seen by any living man for many years. It was a challenge, and with my own interest in languages being what it was, I would have loved to have spent time working on its translation. But as fate would have it, what I decided was not meant to be, for we found ourselves with our own problems. People everywhere had been warned to keep their eyes and ears peeled for French spies. Normally, our first job when setting up a new location is to gather up any charters and notices and talk to people in the towns to find out who is who and get the lay of the land. But people heard our accents and were reluctant to talk to us. Some just being plain ignorant, but others were genuinely scared. We sounded strange and funny to their ear and looked upon with mistrust. We were not easily deterred, though. We were used to being shunned as vagrants and vagabonds. It would just mean we'd have to change our approach, find the best way forward for us. Pulcinella had been word-mongering all his life. He could write up a basic script in no time, and the performers would know just how to improvise on what he wrote. We just had to find a way around the accents. It was decided to use more mime and slapstick than words. It meant our style would be different, but the motto of performers everywhere has always been the same: the show must go on. And our performers thrived on challenges. Challenges made life more exciting anyway. We had one other major decision to make, that of where to live. We had become so used to living in my family home, it had been good to have a base to return to, especially in the winter when weather was harsh. We'd been paid a substantial amount of money to secure the transport of the stone to England, so it seemed only right to put that money to good use. We all agreed to purchase a house large enough to accommodate the whole troupe. The problem was where? From our last visit to England, Pulcinella and I had noticed that most of the theatres were based in and around London, with others opening up along the west coast of the country. Rather than compete with them on their own grounds, it seemed wise to move north-east, where, other than the occasional assembly rooms, there were far fewer theatres, plenty of deprived countrymen just hungry for entertainment. We also needed somewhere fairly central to most of the north-east, within easy reach of the cities. We found a lovely place, just a few short miles from Durham City and the city of Newcastle, and a special bonus for me, it was near enough to the seaside, which I always loved. I could even take my puppets to the beach and entertain the children. They'd love it. It had been years since we'd last been in England, and I was worried that Pulcinella wouldn't cope, for England held bad memories for him. After all, he'd not been back here since he killed Scaramouche in his drunken, drug-crazed rage, and nearly had his head chopped off. On top of our leaving France so as not to be caught and beheaded, and the long journey we'd just completed over land and sea, and the traipsing to the northeast of England to find a home, it was a lot for him to cope with. He's never been what you would call a responsible person, taking nothing serious as a rule, but these past few months he had behaved really well. He'd taken control for getting all of us to safety, but I could see his mask falling a little more every day. He needed a break. We all needed a break. Time to recharge our batteries, while at the same time coming up with an idea of how we were going to adapt to our new way of performing. We thought about changing our names, because Pulcinella was worried that he was still wanted for murder. It's been more than 100 years, I tried to tell him. But when you live as long as we have, time has little meaning. It just passes. But he did listen and stopped being so anxious. But you know the Yorkshire saying, there's nowt as queer as folk. Well, as fate would have it, the northern dialect produced a natural change to our names. Pulcinella would introduce us as Pulcinella and Joni, pronouncing his name Pulcinella, and mine as Joni. But when people repeated our names, they pronounced us as Punchinella and Judy. I thought people can be downright ignorant at times, but Pulcinella loved it. Judy, 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 said Pulcinella, trying out the name for good measure. I like it, he said. We should keep these names even between ourselves, just as a precaution. Judy, he paused, by way of trying to remind himself to call me by that name. For the rest of the evening he wandered round, repeating my name to himself. But if I have to call you Punchinella, it's likely to be shortened to Punch, is it not? I asked, turning round to find myself talking to a now empty room. I laughed aloud to myself and made a silent wager of how long it would be before his name was abbreviated. It took a while, but after considerable thought, I decided I quite liked my name. Punch and Judy. I mean, Punchinella and Judy, I smiled. It'll take a bit of getting used to, but anything for a peaceful life, I thought. Knowing that our accents were a problem since we got here, one of our men who dealt with making props came up with an idea of how to hide our accents, when performing, that is, not all the time. He came up with an invention he called a swaddle. He made it out of 2 strips of metal bound around a cotton-taped reed. It changed Puncinella's voice all right, but now his words sounded harsh and raspy. We needed a local chap to act as our translator. He would interpret Punchenella's words, or make them up based on his reactions. And he could double up as our bottler. Problem solved. All seemed to be working out fine, until we found that the bottler was stealing and pocketing what he stole. Usually a bottler would be part of our troupe, live with us, sharing all we earned, and be part of one big family. But this lad didn't consider himself to be one of us. He lived with his own family and had no appreciation of how important our reputation was to us. Street performers are often thought to be rogues and vagabonds and not to be trusted. Maybe that is true for many other performers, but we, comedy dell'arte, prided ourselves on being trustworthy rogues, and our reputation meant a lot to us. This bottler was being inventive, to say the least. When donations were not proffered by the audience voluntarily, he was not averse to taking a donation or two for himself from the unsuspecting onlookers. This was not acceptable, so it came to pass that it was decided that the bottler would carry the jar in one hand and hold a fly in his other. If the fly escaped, it was assumed he was stealing. And it worked.